The temple stood in darkness, ancient stones holding centuries of whispered prayers and forgotten secrets. In the flickering candlelight, a young boy moved quietly through the corridors, his small feet barely making a sound on the worn floor. He had been given to this place as a child, a living offering to serve the aging priest whose eyes were failing him, whose connection to the divine seemed as dim as his fading sight. But something was stirring in the darkness, something that would change the course of history forever. The first time he heard his name called in the night, the boy ran to his master, certain the old priest needed him. But the elderly man only looked confused, his clouded eyes searching the shadows. "I didn't call you, child. Go back to sleep." The second time it happened, the same response. By the third time, terror gripped both of them as they realized the truth. Someone else was calling the boy's name, someone they couldn't see. What the aging priest told the child next would haunt him for the rest of his life. If the voice calls again, answer it. Say you're listening. The boy's hands trembled as he returned to his bed, knowing that whatever spoke to him in the darkness would change everything. And when that voice came again, deep and resonating through his very soul, the child whispered the words that would seal his destiny forever. The message he received that night was devastating. The priest who had raised him, the man he loved like a father, would lose everything. His family line would be cut off, his legacy destroyed, his sons would die in a single day. The boy wept as he delivered this prophecy, watching the color drain from the old man's face as each word struck like a physical blow. But every word would come true with terrifying precision. Years passed, and the boy grew into a man whose reputation spread like wildfire across the land. People came from distant villages to hear him speak, kings sent messengers seeking his counsel, and enemies whispered his name in fear. He had become something unprecedented, a voice of absolute authority in a world of chaos and corruption. When he spoke, nations trembled. When he prophesied, rulers prepared for war or peace. When he condemned, dynasties fell. But power like this came at a price that few could imagine bearing. The people eventually came to him with a demand that chilled him to the bone. They wanted a king, not a judge, not a prophet, but a monarch like the surrounding nations had. They were rejecting the system he represented, choosing visible power over invisible guidance. He warned them of the consequences with passionate intensity. A king would take their sons for his armies, their daughters for his palace, their crops for his treasury, their freedom for his glory. They would cry out for relief from the very king they were demanding, but it would be too late. They didn't listen. They never listened when comfort was at stake. So he found himself standing before a tall, impressive young man who seemed perfect for the role. Strong, handsome, charismatic, everything a king should be on the surface. As he poured the sacred oil over the young man's head, marking him as the chosen ruler, he felt a deep sadness settling in his chest. He was creating something beautiful that would become something terrible, and he knew it. But sometimes destiny demands that we participate in tragedies we cannot prevent. At first, the relationship between the prophet and the king was everything it should have been. The ruler sought his counsel, followed his guidance, and honored him publicly. But power is a strange poison that works slowly, changing people from the inside out. The king began making decisions without consulting him, started believing his own press, stopped seeing the prophet as a guide and began seeing him as a threat. The breaking point came when the king decided he could perform sacred rituals himself, that his royal authority superseded spiritual protocol. Standing in the temple, watching the king burn incense with his own hands, the prophet felt his heart break. This was the moment he had dreaded, the moment when the student surpasses the teacher not in wisdom but in arrogance. The words that came out of his mouth next would destroy their relationship forever. The kingdom would be taken from him and given to someone better. The king's transformation was complete now. The grateful young man had become a paranoid ruler who saw enemies everywhere, especially in the prophet who had once been his greatest supporter. But the prophet's work wasn't finished. In secret, in a small village, he found another candidate for the throne, a shepherd boy who seemed impossibly young, impossibly humble, impossibly unsuited for leadership by every earthly measure. As he anointed this second king while the first still lived, the prophet understood the terrible complexity of his calling. He was creating a civil war, setting up a conflict between two men he had personally chosen for the same throne. The weight of this decision pressed down on him like a physical force. But the voice that had called him as a child was clear. Sometimes peace comes only through conflict. Sometimes healing requires the surgeon's knife. The years that followed were marked by violence, betrayal, and political chaos. The first king, now completely consumed by madness and jealousy, hunted the second king across the countryside like a wild animal. The prophet watched from the shadows as his two choices played out their deadly drama, knowing that every death in this civil war was partially his responsibility. This was the price of obedience to powers greater than human understanding, but even death couldn't end his influence. Years later, when the kingdom was in crisis and the current king was desperate for guidance, something extraordinary happened. Through a forbidden ritual, the first king demanded to speak with the prophet one last time, even though he had been dead for years. What emerged from that supernatural encounter was a final prophecy of doom, delivered from beyond the grave with the same terrible accuracy that had marked his entire life. The dead prophet's words rang out with devastating clarity. The kingdom would fall, the king would die, and everything would change by tomorrow. Even in death, his voice carried the weight of absolute truth, proving that some influences transcend the boundaries of life itself. This is the story of a man whose childhood encounter with mystery led to a lifetime of impossible responsibility. A boy who heard voices became a kingmaker, a prophet who shaped nations, a leader whose decisions echoed through generations. His name was Samuel, and his legacy reminds us that the most ordinary people can become channels for the most extraordinary changes in history. The question that haunts us today is the same one that haunted him. When we hear the voice calling us in the darkness, will we have the courage to answer? And when we're given the power to change the world, will we use it wisely, knowing that every choice we make today becomes tomorrow's reality for countless others? Some voices, once heard, can never be ignored. Some decisions, once made, can never be undone. And some legacies, once established, continue shaping the world long after their creators have returned to dust. What voice is calling your name in the darkness? What kingdom are you being asked to build or tear down? What legacy will you leave when your chapter in this great story comes to an end? The boy who became Samuel shows us that ordinary people can become extraordinary instruments of change, but only if they're willing to pay the price of profound responsibility. In a world that often seems chaotic and without direction, his story reminds us that there are still voices worth listening to, still truths worth speaking, and still destinies worth fulfilling, no matter the cost.